Yep.
And then do we have the link? Does this deck have the survey link in it?
It should.
If not, I could put it inside the chat.
Don, I'm sorry for what happened this morning too. I know you've got a family thing
That's
going
all
on.
right. So after you do a questions, then we have our contact info, save the date, our survey, right? All of those slides are in this presentation. The ones we added to the end.
If not, we can pivot to the other PowerPoint.
Okay. All right. That'll be good.
Is this the
John,
last slide in your
after
deck,
the
Teresa?
questions.
Yes, it is. That's the last
Okay.
slide of ours.
So when we get to that one, I'll have you stop sharing, and then we'll share our next webinar series schedule and all that stuff. So after we get done with questions, we'll have you stop sharing, and then one of us will share and show the last 3 slides with the survey in it.
Okay. The only thing I worry about is when I share, will they be able to see my notes?
No, we can
No.
only see the slide deck.
I mean, will I be able to see my notes?
You'll
Is
have
there
to
any way
Um,
somebody else can share my piece?
The only way for you to see your notes, unless you run the PowerPoint on your own computer and one of us shares, is you have to be.
I mean, I just want to make sure when I share it that I'm able to see my notes.
Yeah,
That's what I'm concerned about.
yeah, you should be.
Without-
You
I
should
don't
be.
know. You can do that on Zoom, can you?
Yeah, and they won't be able to see it, but you can.
All right, folks, it's 10
I'm just-
a.m.
Yeah, I'm just used to somebody else doing all that part, but that's fine. As long as I could share this without it being an issue.
Can
We
we
can-
reset the PowerPoint to the beginning slides? We're recording right now. It's 10 a.m. I'm going to go live to Facebook.
Teresa,
We need
can
to
you
go to the beginning of the
back to the
slides.
first slide? The beginning
Oh, you're
slide.
asking me? Sorry, guys.
Mhm.
So am I controlling the slides then?
Yeah, so that you can see the notes.
Okay, cool. So I'll just control the slides.
Yep.
Wonderful.
Yep.
Like that better.
Right, here we go, admitting people from the waiting room. Good morning, all. Welcome to the webinar today. It's a great time to adjust your audio. We're going to take about 20 seconds here, and we'll get started.
Good morning, everybody. So nice to see some familiar faces and names. We got people that are sharing their cameras this morning. Susie, Sharon, thank you.
I like your backdrop, Wayne.
Yeah, it's pretty cool. We had Ava create some of these for us. We figured we better get in the loop with getting some virtual backgrounds for AIVRTTAC. So thank you. My head looks just about the size of those buttes behind me. I fit right in the landscape.
All right, while we're setting up here, if you'd like to take the opportunity, put your name, your program name. If anyone's joining you, watching with you together today, if you could add their name to the chat as well, and a tribe's greeting if you'd like, that'd be great.
Hey, Susie.
Good morning.
Morning.
Bringing in a couple more people here.
Hi, Sharon.
All right, if by chance you're joining us on phone today, Couple things to remember: you can use *6 to mute and unmute, and *9 to raise your name. We'll see a hand come up, and you can rise, and you'll rise to the top of the list. So if you have a question and you're on the phone, you can use *9 to raise your hand and lower your hand, and *6 to mute and unmute.
All right, Teresa, you want to go to the next slide for me, please?
Sure.
You can skip on over to the third one as well.
Actually, yeah, go to the third one because John just gave the instructions, so we're good.
Looks like people are very familiar with the chat in Zoom. So when someone's speaking and if you have a question, you can put it in chat. We'll be moderating that space and we'll try to insert it where we can. We have a pretty robust presentation today, so it might take a little time to get it out there. So please, any kind of comments, recommendations, links, questions, everyone's experience is valued here, so please share and allow time for others to share as well. Next slide, please.
Actually, just a minute, John, I'm gonna have, would you back up, Teresa?
Sure.
Thank you. So we are very excited to be partnering for this presentation because we have heard from many of the AIVR's programs the need for support in understanding mental health and how it impacts our VR consumers. So Jamie reached out to Teresa and Sean, and we had a great discussion about how we can partner. And so I'm really excited to start this presentation. And the group that Teresa and John work with, it's the National American Indian Alaska Native Mental Health Technology Transfer Center. And they're based out of the Native Center for Behavioral Health at the University of Iowa. So it's a lot of information that we will share with you when we send this out to the participants. So it'll be, the name can be found there. And today we have Teresa and Sean with us, and Jamie are going to be the people on the front line talking today. And I'm just going to be in the chat box like normal, answering questions and prompting people and targeting, or no, I mean, asking for support from certain people in our group. So now we can go to the next slide, Teresa. Thank you. So today what we're looking for in the webinar objectives is we want to be able to recognize, we want participants to be able to recognize a mental health or mental illness diagnosis when they see it in the documentation. We also want to be able to determine the best approach to managing a mental health VR case. So one of the things that we've recognized is in working with consumers with mental illness, it's a little different in how we support them and provide services to help them find employment. So we want to be able to determine what approach is the best. We also want to be able to develop some strategies for service provision to these consumers. Again, the provision is just a little bit different based on the need of the individual. So we also want to be able to assess the impact of the mental health issues in the community. So when we start looking at competitive community employment, integrated community employment, what are these mental health issues? What's the impact on the community? How is it impacting the individual in the community? So there's a lot of different questions there that we have surrounding that. So again, I'm watching the chat box. If you guys have questions, please put it in the chat box. As we go through this, we'll answer questions. But if it's a more in-depth question, we do have a period of time at the end of the presentation where we're going to open it up for all questions. So, but as it pops in your head, if you're like me, it'll slip out if you don't write it down. So please put it in the chat box and I'll address it there or have other people address it as we go along. All right, Teresa, I'm going to turn it over to you. Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much. So today's presentation is introducing a series of travel webinars focusing on travel vocational rehabilitation, TVR services, and mental health care. This is our first webinar into a series that we hope that we're going to continue to provide for you and your audience. The goal for this series is to provide you with information on the services that you provide for your consumers as a tribal voc rehab specialist. I hope that you enjoy this session. My personal goal is providing these sessions just to make you more aware of yourself, more aware of the people you serve, and then your roles to help you do your job better. I must say that we are funded through SAMHSA, Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Technology, and the content of this webinar is not the creation of the presenters and the opinions expressed through SAMHSA. We are what is called the Native Center for Behavioral Health. We have 3 centers, the ATC, Addiction Technology Center, the MHTTC, Mental Health Transfer Technology Center, and the Mental Health Transfer Technology Center K-12 program, and the PTTC Center, which is the Prevention Technology Transfer Center. We work with Native communities, American Indians and Alaska Natives nationwide. We are located at the University of Iowa in Iowa. My name is Teresa Brewington. I am the program manager for the National American Indian and Alaska Native Mental Health TTC K-12 School Supplement. I am an enrolled member of the Gohari tribe and a descendant of the Lumbee tribe. I hold a master's in educational leadership, a master's in business administration, 36 hours towards a master's in counseling, and a year towards my PhD in education. I have held positions as a director at several mental health agencies and have worked directly with SMI clients in the voc rehab settings and in day reporting centers where we actually developed and helped them get the skills that they needed to gain employment. I was also a school counselor who served a majority of Hispanic and Latino students. I've also served as a foster care agency supervisor where we work directly with Salt River Pima Community Indian community, placing Native American children in foster homes. Prior to coming to the Native Center of Behavioral Health, my prior position was an elementary school principal for Native children at the Meskwaki Elementary School. I just want to say that I love my Native people and I have devoted my life's work on bettering the lives of all Native people. Sean, would you like to introduce yourself or would you like me to introduce you?
I can do that. Hello, my name is Sean Bear. I'm from the Meskwaki tribe in Tama, Iowa. My Indian name is Giokuk. I'm from the Bear clan. I guess you can read about me if you'd like to. I'm the co-director at the National American Indian and Alaska Native Agency. One thing about a lot of the centers there throughout the United States, the map that was shown, there's always other agencies that you can call to if you want to. Thank you.
So I think before we even begin with this series, we have to discuss the underlying issues facing Native Americans today, and that is historical trauma. I'm sure that we all have heard about historical trauma, but please know that historical trauma is in every life of Native Americans. It is part of who we are. So you need to understand this when you're working with the Native communities. You need to understand that you need to understand our history. As many of you know, European explorers came into the US around the 1500s to occupy what they said was beautiful landscape and abundance of animals. They found people here with their own existing languages. These people were spread out across the United States, and they were hunters and farmers. They built towns and traded with other tribes. These were the people the European explorers met with when the ships landed. Today, we call these people American Indians. As we know, they brought terrible diseases such as smallpox, measles, chickenpox, and influenza. It is unknown why these diseases affected our Native peoples in the way that it did, but there were many deaths because of this. For those who did survive, many other changes came from European contact because they came with firearms and armor, resulting in slave trade, wars, land invasion, and it became the European quest for what is now the United States. The native way of life was absolutely destroyed. As part of this conquest, native women and children were killed. They pitted tribes against tribes, making the lack of native unity easier for the settlers to take over the lands. They were forbidden to speak their language. They were forbidden to practice their own culture, and they were forced off their original homelands and placed to what we call today reservations. The discovery of America is the greatest disaster in the history of our country. Research by some scholars provides population estimates that were approximately 112 million natives before 1492 here in this land. However, other researchers has disputed that amount. Prior to boarding schools, Native Americans either did not go to school or were educated by their own peoples. In the late 19th century, Native children were removed from their families and placed far away in boarding schools. They faced abuse of every kind you could think. They were taught the white men's ways. They were used as child labor. They were taught to speak only English, and they were forbidden to practice their native language and cultures. Their way of life was absolutely assimilated, resulting in the extermination of their complete way of life and culture. As the U.S. educational system was formed to remove the Indian out of the man. As a result, this brought shame and negative self-images amongst our Native peoples. Natives have always been resilient. We've always been people of strength and courage, with a strong connection to family and Mother Earth. Out of the European contact, we get what is called historical trauma. Historical trauma is defined as an emotional and psychological wound over a lifetime and passed from generation to generation to generation. It was to remove it assimilated from the removal of our culture, to assimilate us to what they wanted in their mainstream society for the United States, including their benefits in Christianity. Historical trauma results in negative feelings about oneself. It also has to do with geographical locations where Native communities were relocated to. It causes many challenges because in these communities you have lower paying jobs, higher unemployment rates, non-equality, poverty, poor living conditions, inadequate educational programs and systems of opportunities, insufficient health and insufficient behavioral health programs. Because of this, Native people face many challenges such as undereducated, unemployment, poverty, violence, abuse, poor health, lacking mental support, addiction to drugs and alcohol, even the truth, honestly, about Thanksgiving and Columbus Day that is still even celebrated today is an insult to our Native peoples. Sean, would you like to add to that?
Yes, I would. Okay, so when you're looking at historical trauma, we need to remember, in a sense, that it's cumulative emotional and psychological wounding for like a mass group of peoples. So one thing that we need to remember too is the intent by Maria Yellow Horse Brayport was for the historical trauma, in a sense, to bring light to what has happened to a lot of the natives. It's when you look at it, you need to kind of look at it more like almost like it's a diagnosis. So that way you know how to work with this person. But the way that we normally work with historical trauma is you have to remember that all people have some type of trauma anyway. So remembering that historical trauma, the trauma that people have experienced, and anybody, you know, like whether they've been veterans or anything like that, that they also may have PTSD. So you need to look at this more like compoundedly and to be able to work on those different issues. One thing is to remember also, I mean, when you think about it, that what had happened here in America, you know, some people now call it the American Holocaust, but and one thing that they call that is that how Hitler conducted the Holocaust against the Jews in Europe, he mimicked already what was being done in America to the natives. So we need to also remember that not to just concentrate on the atrocities and things like that that is being done out there, because there's so many different people doing historical trauma, but it's more like re-traumatizing them. So we need to work beyond that and to heal the people.
Sean, this is Lee.
Yes.
What I'd like to share with the audience is I graduated from the boarding school called Phoenix Indian High School in 1973, the same high school that both of my parents attended but didn't complete. And I'm sure my time at PI was somewhat different from the time my parents were there, because I recall stories that my mother shared with us regarding the treatment. And during those days, they were not allowed to come home at all. While as the time I was there, we were allowed to come home during the summers. And my point is, during those years, our adolescent years or our teenage years, our young adult life, is when a lot of our Hopi traditions are being taught. By that time, we are already initiated into one or two religious societies, but we're unable to participate in the ceremonies to gain a better understanding of our responsibility and what it means to be Hopi. My other point is, when we talk about the boarding school as an effect on historical trauma, we need to remember that there are still many of us who experienced the boarding school, but have chosen not to speak out. And it's not until more recently that I have began to look at how it has affected me. And I guess I would say within my village, I would be considered an elder, but I don't have the full knowledge of the Hopi ceremonies. And it's also a concern to me that with the loss of language and the loss of our traditional practices, and what does our Hopi culture hold for the future Hopi youth? And what is the appropriate setting to talk about mental health in our respective communities? Thank you.
Thank you, Lee and Teresa and Sean. And I just want to share with the group today that all of a sudden I'm feeling emotional during this section. And I want to give everyone the opportunity to share if they would like. You ready to move on, Teresa?
Yes, I do want to add to what he said. He's absolutely right. You know, when Native children were removed from their homes and forbidden to go back to their native homes, they were, you know, that was a time of adolescence, a time of shaping who they are to become And yet they were taking to these schools to assimilate them into the Western view of life instead of their native beliefs. And again, I would have to say that it is very closely related to what Sean refers to as PTSD.
I would like to say something. I really knew nothing about boarding schools, and I think a lot of people didn't, but in the 90s, they started talking about it in our area. And I had just shared that the Thomas Indian School, our office actually sits on the site of the old Thomas Indian School. It was a huge complex, and a lot of natives from all over Indian country came here. I remember my grandmother telling how hard it was for them at first to keep Indians here because they would run away. They were real good at running away and they couldn't catch them. So they really tightened up. But, my great grandmother can remember them trying to even use shared stories of them trying to use our people as slaves. But again, they couldn't do it because any chance they got to run, they would run. But a lot of Indian families on our territory are large families, 5 or more children. And I know for our home, it was run like a military because my mom and dad didn't go there overnight, but they went to the day school. And I'm probably gonna cry because when we never understood our parents running our household like that, because it was so rigid and so strict, and not a lot of emotion. So when we heard about that, my older brother and I have an older sister, but my older brother and I were at this discussion in regards to boarding schools, and he and I were just so emotional after that because we finally understood our parents and why we were raised like that. And I can tell you, I ran what I was before I came to VR. I was on management, running huge household, huge custodial units in hospitals or colleges. And I'm like so organized and so meticulous. And it comes from my mother being taught that in the boarding schools. And in fact, I did a presentation in front of a bunch of people. As I was talking, I was folding a folded sheet and I folded it to perfection. And I said, and that's my outcome from the boarding schools that my mother gave me because they had to fold those sheets to perfection. And, that was my demonstration to them that, my girls do the same thing. And they're just, a lot of them are small residual things at this point. But, definitely, even today, a lot of our older natives on our territory, they don't seek services. I think because, I don't know, we're taught to be strong and not to show that emotion. So, thanks.
I'd like to add to that. The foundation of historical trauma, it is the foundation in all of our Native lives, everybody. It's affects you, even though you were not even there, because of the stories that you've heard from your parents and your grandparents and your great-grandparents. It's not only has it done that, but when you're talking about historical trauma, because of what was done to us, because it resulted in those feelings of being unwanted, not knowing who we are, not able to practice our culture, it brought a negative self-esteem or negative self-image, and that self-image has been passed and passed and passed through now Native generations. So it is the groundwork, in my opinion, to everything that we do when we work with Native peoples. we have to understand the piece of historical trauma.
And I think a lot of our parents resorted to alcohol to cope with not having their children there. And so then again, that just started another social ill amongst a lot of reservations. So yeah, a lot of alcoholism yet on our territory.
Any other questions before we move along? So we're going to continue to talk a little bit more about historical trauma because, again, like I said, it is very important when you're dealing with Native American communities. Just a couple of statistics I wanted to share with you. According to the National Indian Council on Aging, Native communities experience higher rates of suicide compared to any other racial and ethnic group in the U.S., with suicide being the 8th leading cause of death for American Indians and Alaska Natives across all ages. Native youth, 10 to 24, suicide is the 2nd leading cause of death. Native youth suicide is 2.5 times higher than the overall national average, making these rates the highest across any other ethnic or racial group. Also, according to the American Psychiatric Association, Native peoples in America report experience serious psychological distress 2.5 times more than the general population. Native people in America between the ages of 15 and 19 are more than double that of non-Native whites. Native people in America start to use alcohol and other drugs at a younger age at higher rates than any other ethnic group. Mental health disparities, American Indians and Alaska Natives are huge as compared to others. Another thing to consider is cultural disconnection, socioeconomic conditions, geographical locations, health disparities, and all the issues that are aiding in all of this, because you have to understand that piece too. For example, when natives were relocated off of their lands and then relocated again and relocated again, they were relocated in lands that were not prosperous for growing crops, growing corn, and doing this. They were located in native lands that were isolated, native lands that were put by swamps or dirty water, which also aids in all of this that we're going to be speaking about and part of who we are. Before I go on, Sean, would you like to say some words about that? I didn't really get into the effects of historical trauma.
Yes. I know that the rates are very high in the use of substances and stuff like that, but also remember that Native Americans, especially on the tribes on their lands, also have the highest rates of abstinence than any other ethnicity. One thing to think about is when we are assessing people who come in that we may think are Native or that they self-identify as Native, is that we need to also honor their self-identity and how they perceive themselves. Not all people will be or feel like they're part of the tribe. Maybe they're more likely to speak to their friends and peers more than they are anybody else, depending upon where they are within the tribe. They may say they're Native in one part, but not in another part. So the way that we normally think about that is looking at an assessment for Natives is also finding out how they believe about themselves and their background as well, because we kind of break that down into 3 different categories. Is we have those who are traditional, those that are more acculturated or assimilated, and those that are bicultural. Now, the traditional peoples are more likely, in a sense, to speak their own language, participate in ceremonies, practice or live their lives with the cultural beliefs in mind, maybe more humble, take more time to answer, formulate thoughts. Those who are more acculturated are more likely to attend church. They may not attend ceremonies. They might not know their language. They might not want anything to do with their cultural beliefs and practices. Because what happens is during the boarding school era, is that many of those people who went through there, they wanted to keep their children from harm, their grandchildren from harm, in case this kept going on. So many of them wouldn't even teach them that. So it goes on where the next generation might not know as much. And then the following generation might know even less. So we also have to remember those kind of things. And bicultural people, they can be anywhere on this spectrum, really. I mean, you can have somebody who looks nothing like a native, but is totally traditional. You can have somebody who's like full-blooded and totally be assimilated. But we need to kind of take their self-identity into context here, because we need to respect that as well. We cannot just assume all natives are traditional or practice their traditions or have the same amount of knowledge. We can't assume they live on a reservation or assume they will self-identify as native. They might not even be comfortable or confident in being natives, but thank you.
Yeah, and I agree with that, Sean. And I think we could have an entire conversation on that as well, because to me, that is also part of our identity crisis and part of the historical trauma. So that's very interesting that you say it that way. But yes, there are definitely natives that identify differently. So to go talk about the effects of historical trauma that you're going to see on the PowerPoint, just historical trauma alone can look like a mental illness because it has a lot of different effects. It could be a breakdown in traditional native families. It could be alcoholism, isolation, depression, anxiety, suicidal thoughts, child abuse and neglect, physical abuse, PTSD, general loss of meaning and sense of hope, sense of not belonging, poverty and homelessness, genetics, and there's several other things. These are just an example. So, any other questions before we move along? Jamie, is it okay that I go to the next slide?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay, so here you have the Canton Insane Asylum. This is kind of like what it looks like on the outside. You'll also see a grave marker where people are buried. That's actually within the golf course there. Okay, next slide. Okay, so here you'll see that there was almost 400 inmates placed here in the Hiawatha Insane Asylum. The other word is the Canton Indian Insane Asylum. One thing to remember here is that a lot of the people who were placed in here did not and were not mentally ill at all. A lot of them, the reason they were placed there was more political, and that leaders and medicine people who had great influence on the people were placed here. Remembering that these natives didn't speak English. They didn't receive treatment of any sorts. They were just housed. There was no medical staff. And during this time, 121 people died. When they weren't able to speak English, there's no way that they could have been assessed by non-natives in a mental health assessment, because they have to be able to speak to them. Because a lot of things are by self-report. So it's kind of strange like that. But a lot of the times, because our beliefs were different, Then the Euro-American colonials at the time, and the way that mental health is today, there's a big difference with culture. So even within the DSM-5, it starts on page like 749. There's 11 pages that have to do with culture. And it even says on there that culture alone can lead to a misdiagnosis if the people taking the assessment are not aware of that culture. So part of the Canton Indian Insane Asylum is that it brought in a lot of money. Tourists came in there to see it, and they would pay money to do that. That's one reason they didn't want it closed, because the money that was brought in. There were some staff there, and there was a turnover at the time, and that's when they wanted it closed down, because, and a lot of the natives wanted it closed down. And even children and things like that who were in boarding schools were threatened, in a sense, by that, is saying, if you don't behave, we're going to send you to the Canton Indian Insane Asylum. And everybody knew that was a death sentence. Thank you.
And Sean, I'm going to take that because I agree with you 100%. And even today, when you're having an assessment, if they can't understand your native culture and your native beliefs, you can be underdiagnosed, misdiagnosed, or overly diagnosed. I moved on to the next slide. Sean, do you want to talk about that for just a minute? I think
Try to do that. Yeah. Okay. So to date, there's no culturally adapted mental health assessments for Native Americans. None of them have been adapted to us. The DSM system, in a sense, through 1 through 5, has not properly taken into account Indigenous cultural beliefs and practices when it comes to the diagnoses of mental health disorders. So, as many may be aware, there's been Native Americans and medicine people that have been diagnosed or almost diagnosed with mental health disorders when they don't have it. I think I've met up to like 15 medicine people now today that were diagnosed or almost diagnosed. Well, they were diagnosed. There were some that were almost diagnosed with mental health disorders. A lot of times when this happens is when they haven't known about their gifts yet. So sometimes when these gifts open up, if people are able to see things, hear things, and things like that they hadn't done before. So if they're not aware of it, they might end up seeing a doctor trying to find out if something's wrong with them. But this is part of historical trauma. When you look at many of the tribes around different parts of the United States today, is that, and even up in Canada and things, is that before, about every tribe had medicine peoples. So they would know when somebody is going to come, because the spirits would tell them, so, oh, that person there, you need to take underneath their wing because they're going to be a medicine people someday, and that they might take over your spot. So they would kind of teach them when they're younger. But today, in many areas of the country within tribes, they might not have a medicine person at all. So what happens is when these people come up, in a sense, and their gifts open up, it's almost like a door being swung open, and all of a sudden, depending upon the power that they're going to have, it comes flooding through. Now, if only a small gift comes through first and then one at a time, it makes it a little bit easier for them to get used to. But if it all floods through all at once, they're going to be seeing things, hearing things, sensing things, all these things like that. They might not be able to tell things. What they're seeing is from the past, present, or future. They might not be able to tell it's like what they're hearing is good or bad or anything like that. They might not know what they're seeing is okay to be seen. So a lot of that comes into play with this, and that people need to understand that just because the DSM may see this as a mental health disorder, it doesn't mean there really is one. One thing to check about that is during an assessment is if you suspect that there is some kind of psychosis or mental health disorder coming on, is that also to get an opinion by a tribal member from their own tribe, which is better because their beliefs are going to be similar. You can check with the community or family, but remember, this community or family should come from a totally different area of the United States because there's so many different belief systems in this. And that's come up. I mean, people have said, well, I've worked with these tribes before, so I know Indians. But you might work with a totally different tribe. And we know that some tribes may be more traditional than others. So you can bring in medicine people or healers, spiritual people to also assess this person to see whether this is a mental health diagnosis or whether this is something that is cultural. But also remember too, is that if this person's having too much difficulty, because one thing that the DSM system kind of recognized is distress levels, in a sense, when somebody has a mental health disorder. So what is this person's distress level? Are they okay with it? Or do they need something, medication anyway, that might help them to get through that point? So you can't just totally leave that out. I mean, sometimes there's cases where this person may need to be medicated for a while or something to help them through. Thank you.
Are there any questions on that before I move on? Okay, so we're going to go ahead and move on to the next slide.
Hello.
Oh.
It's Philip Albert from Fairbanks, Alaska. I don't have a question, but years ago I used to see a psychiatric doctor, psychiatrist, and he asked me if a bipolar disorder had anything to do with traditional spiritual medicine. He said an elder told him that. So I just want to make that comment.
Thank you. Anybody else? Okay, so now we'll move on to mental health diagnosis and its types. And I'm reading from the Western world. So I'm reading from the American Psychiatric Association and what they define as mental illnesses. Mental illnesses are health conditions involving changes in emotion, thinking, and or behaviors. Mental illnesses are associated with stress and problems functioning in society, work, and family and daily activities. Mental illnesses are very common. They affect 1 in 5 adults. 1 in 24 adults is diagnosed with an SMI, a serious mental illness. And then 1 in 12 report having a mental diagnosis and a substance abuse disorder. Sean, would you like to add to that in any way?
No, I'm fine with it.
Okay. All right, and Sean, I'm going to let you speak on the next slide about the types of mental disorders. Can you hear me, Sean?
I guess I was speaking and muted. Okay, so from here, a lot of that, what I looked at was from our spiritual roundtables we have. We've had it since 2014. And what we do here within the roundtables to bring in medicine people, spiritual people, healers from around the country from different native tribes. So within here, we went through different mental health disorders and things like that as well. But some of these are kind of common within some of the of what we spoke to, especially schizophrenia. When looking at that, is that seeing, hearing, sensing are delusions. Those are the beliefs, is that those are something that really came up that can be very common within the culture of natives and also the DSM. So, but when we're looking at that, so psychology, long before when it started, was the study of the soul. That's what it kind of came down to. It's a study of the soul. Today, we kind of look at it as a scientific study of the mind and behavior. But so there's also clinical interviews. You're looking at the concerns, you're looking at the history. You also have the initial interview, which is likely done by office staff, and then later on by in a clinical or by a professional. So voc rehab, when you're looking at voc rehab, consists of services that are designed to facilitate the entrance and return to work by peoples with disabilities, those who have recently acquired an injury or disability. This may include evaluation, training, career counseling, guidance, referral, on-the-job training. But when you're looking at the types of mental health disorders, this may also play a role in how you place them. So bipolar, of course, you have depression, and you also have times of they're manic. So manic, when they're manic, they're more likely to be able to have experiences, especially if they're unmedicated, that it can even look like schizophrenia, where they're seeing and hearing and sensing things and things like that, delusions. So personality disorders, one thing to look at with personality disorders, especially if you're like looking at some of these assessments, is that even with the Minnesota, the multiphasic inventory, MMPI, natives have always scored high on that. I mean, it's not as accurate for natives as it is for others. So post-traumatic stress disorder, when you're looking at that, remember that is so all this trauma that's built up. But remembering that post-traumatic stress disorder doesn't just happen all of a sudden from one trauma. I mean, these are many traumas that are happening through the lifespan. And the more trauma that one experiences, the more likely the chance of them developing PTSD later on. So psychotic disorders, including schizophrenia, of course, remembering that they have elements there that where they're seeing, hearing, sensing things and things like that, that may kind of mimic some of the things with the culture. Because what happens is our belief systems, when we talk about spirits, we're talking about our dreams, we're talking about things that maybe people seen on the tribe or heard or sensed or things like that. I mean, our belief systems of owls and snakes and so many different other things, people may see that as odd. I mean, I've even heard a case where people are talking about their dreams, but these were college students, and a teacher overheard them and thought that they were going to commit suicide. So they had them on suicide watch for a while, wouldn't let them leave or anything like that, until finally a native came through, and it was a native teacher. And they said, no, this is very common within the tribes. This is something we do. We talk about our dreams to each other and what they might mean and what they might foretell and things like that. So we're looking at these, we want to take into account the culture with that. Okay, thank you.
Yep, I just want to add to a couple of those points that you were making. I'm not sure if you mentioned bipolar disorder. Bipolar disorder is like a manic depressive. If you've ever worked with somebody that has a bipolar disorder, they're never on the exact same spectrum. They're either real low or they're real high, unless they're taking the proper medications to help that. When you're working with somebody with manic depressive disorder, one day you might go visit them and they're exhausted, they're tired, they're depressed, and they don't want to get out of the bed. The next day that you might go see them, they are high energy, high energetic, and just wanting to get things done. That is bipolar. Co-occurring disorders is when you have several diagnoses, or have been diagnosed with several, because a lot of people are not diagnosed with just one, but several diagnoses. A lot of people are also diagnosed with that, also with addiction to drugs and alcohol. So we always have to remember that. Also remember that all of this ties into genetic issues, environmental issues, and brain activity. Does anybody have any questions about that or want to add anything?
So are you saying that when somebody is on high energy, that could indicate that their mind is racing?
Absolutely. If you're talking about a bipolar disorder,
Yes.
yes. Bipolar disorders are very they're very easily, if you know somebody that has a bipolar disorder and they've been diagnosed correctly, and if you get to know that person, you can very easily see their psychosis where they're at the time, because it is very obvious. I've worked with bipolar disorder clients where I would come in one day and they would act very childlike. And then I would come in the next day and they were high, just like happy and high and everything's wonderful. That is bipolar.
Yeah, one thing you want to look at that with bipolar is that with bipolar, they have to meet both diagnoses of depression and being manic separately. That way, when they have them both, then they kind of come together. There are different kind of types where some are cycle really fast, or they might cycle every 6 months or something like that. They're not always the same. There are some that are kind of go up and down so fast that they stay within kind of certain lines, or some that are go underneath and things like that. So they're more depressed, more likely all the time. But when you're looking also with that anxiety and depression, one thing you can look at that is that depression normally has to do with the past, and anxiety usually has to do with the future. So with their anxiety is fear that something might be happening or going to happen. And depression is something usually that they dealt with in the past. They might not have gotten through a lot of that. So with some of these, especially like with bipolar, you may see more substance abuse with that. And when they're manic, if they're self-medicating, when they're manic, they might take a lower, something like a downer. When they're depressed, they might take an upper. So some of these, and like people with schizophrenia, normally what happens is they use alcohol. So some of these different disorders and things like that also come into play with kind of when they're using substances.
And I'm not sure if we talked about schizophrenia very much, but those are typically the ones that you see that may be, it's a combination of hallucination, of talking to themselves or seeing somebody else, of having delusions. Sometimes these delusions can be very, very real, to the point where you may walk in talking to them and they may not even recognize you. And they may be talking to you about something you have no idea of what they're talking about. And those disorders that could be very unpredictable. So, just go with caution, knowing when you have one of these disorders of schizophrenia, they have triggers, and with those triggers, they could see you, something can trigger them, and they're talking or seeing or hearing what they're responding to, or all three.
Teresa and Sean, this is Lee.
Hi, Lee.
Do you have any recommendation regarding the etiquette of working with clients who have mental health? And what I mean by that is in working with tribal members with disability, we always remember that they're a person first and that their disability should not define them.
That's correct.
And we know that labeling can be very damaging. So what is your take on the proper names to use, but without embarrassing them or making them feel less, and more importantly, educating the community on the etiquette of addressing these individuals in the communities?
Sean, you want to answer that, or would you like me to answer that?
I can start if you'd like to finish. So even though they might have a mental health disorder, I mean, that you're right, it doesn't define them. Also, we need to remember that a lot of the disorders that they have today are no longer just one level, in a sense, how people would say, oh, there's schizophrenia. I don't want to work with them. But we need to remember that it's a spectrum. So some people can be far to the right or very low to the left. I mean, it's not always the same. So, we definitely treat them as a person and not as a diagnosis. And also remember that within SAMHSA, we're looking at stigma. Now, the way that SAMHSA now sees stigma is discrimination. So, and we know that discrimination is against the law. So when we look at that, we need to be able to educate the community about that. And say, well, these are people. It's like with proper medication, proper treatment, things like that, they can live normal lives. I mean, even there's judges, lawyers, attorneys, doctors, psychiatrists, surgeons, and stuff like that have all been diagnosed with schizophrenia, but they operate just normally. I mean, even looking at medication levels, there's a level that when they take the medication, they're perfectly normal. I mean, there's no problem. They're just like anybody else. There's those that take the medication and they might have a very small issue, but that's it. There are one that they take the medication and they might have more difficulty, but they're able to function. There are those who take medication and they might have more difficulty, but with some help they'll get through. But there's also those that take medication and nothing helps them at all. So we can't just lump them all into one sum and treat them all the same. So definitely treat them with courtesy and respect that you would treat anybody else. But some of those that are really fear-based, like when they're paranoid or very fearful for their lives or anything like that, you also have to be careful. I mean, you're looking at borderline personality disorder, and a lot of times they're very attention seeking. So in a sense, you can't let what they do surprise you. In a sense, always act like everything's just fine. And that's one of the way that they work with them is you can't give them that attention. And some of these you have to remember, it's like when they work with certain people, they have different ways of doing it so that it doesn't make it worse.
Thank you, Sean. And were you finished? I'm sorry.
Oh, go ahead.
I want to add to that too. I think something you said that none of these people are going to fix in a box. So you cannot look at this as black and white because it's not. These diagnoses will look different from person to person to person. Also, please note, if you don't learn anything from this webinar today, and I do have a section on this piece, but I don't know that we're going to be able to get to it. But just know that they do not want this disease. This is not their fault. Believe me, they have been discriminated against and they have been bullied. They have been judged. They probably are ashamed and have a low self-image of their self because of this disease. What you can do when you're working with clients is know the person, know their strengths, and work on those strengths. Build a relationship with that person. If you go in and you handle the situation wrong, you could do more harm than you can do good. So if you take away anything today, I want you to take away that. Any questions before we go to the next slide? Okay, so you guys work with seriously mental illness clients. So we wanted to take a few minutes today to really get into that and define what the DSM says about seriously mental illness, and then go from there. SMI, serious mental illness, commonly refers to the diagnosis of psychotic disorders like bipolar, major depressive, manic symptoms, or treatment-resistant depression. SMI can also include anxiety, eating disorders, personality disorders, etc. The key to diagnosing someone with SMI is the degree of the functional impact, if it's severe or not, over multiple diagnoses. There are over 30 subsets now in the DSM-5 that will meet the criteria of SMI. Know that it is long-term, it is persistent, it comes with functional impairments. These impairments means that you're going to have limitations on daily living skills. This often leads to the inability to maintain gainful employment, poor social support, poor social habits, repeated psychiatric hospitalizations, homelessness, criminal justice involvement or incarceration, drug use. They often make poor decisions. They don't cope with problems very well. They may isolate themselves. They may have poor medical conditions. They often fail at work and school, and the suicide rates are much more higher for those that are diagnosed with SMI. The DSM-5 reads that it is a serious functional impairment that substantially interferes or limits at least one major life activity. Examples again are bipolar, schizophrenia, major depression, as well as several others. Remember, it's based on the duration and then the functionality of the impairment that meets the diagnosis for SMI of their daily living. Also note that many do not want to seek treatment, are reluctant to take their medications, and many of them are ashamed, are discriminated against, are poorly treated, and sometimes get poor service, no service, or lack mental health service needs. Sean, you want to add to that?
No, you're fine.
Teresa, I have a question. This is Lee again.
Yes.
Can either you or Sean talk about the legal requirements regarding reporting of this individual who may pose a threat to themselves or others, and how this applies to people who are in the helping profession?
Are you talking about voluntary versus involuntary commitments?
Yes.
Okay, Sean, do you want to take on that task, or would you like me to?
You can go first. Go ahead.
And I'm not going to be an expert, so because my understanding is that this is state to state, and I worked with state voc rehab in the past, not tribal voc rehab. So if your tribe has a plan in action, then follow that plan. I could tell you here in Iowa, mental health services are lacking. very disappointed. The majority of our people that have SMI, honestly, they end up being incarcerated. About a year ago, we closed our group homes and we closed our SMI treatment centers. They were literally put on the streets. I have worked in trying to get people involuntary committed versus voluntary committed. Involuntary commitment means that you and at least one other person has to say that this person is harmful to themselves or others. You have to get it signed by a judge who will agree to this, and then the client will get a court-appointed attorney. Getting them involuntary commitment is not easy. It takes time, it takes a lot of follow-up. Again, I'm going to have to speak with Iowa because I don't know how other states operates, but I could tell you that when they are, if they are committed involuntary, they are first taken to a, what do they call them, assessment center or medical hospital, who then diagnose them. They diagnose to see if they are a danger to themselves or others at that moment in time. So if you went to a home, somebody had a knife at their throat, you went and did this involuntary commitment, you get them to the hospital, that hospital may say they're fine now. Also, I could tell you these hospitals do not take them for a long period of time. If you are persistent, and the key is persistency, you can help them by, before they take them out of this mental health hospital, getting alternative long-term placements for their needs. Voluntary commitments, I'm less familiar with, but with voluntary commitments, it means that, yes, the person says, yes, I will go. And Sean, correct me if I'm wrong. With voluntary commitments, however, that means that person can sign themselves out at any time that they want. Is that correct?
For
voluntary.
Non-voluntary, yes.
No. So in other words, the system is not easy. It's not an easy task. It's very time consuming. It's something that takes a lot of follow-up. I've done many. I would suggest that if you have to do one, that you do a team approach and you get everything while that person is in the hospital being diagnosed, that you have a follow-through plan to tell that judge so that that person can then leave that mental hospital to go to this group home or to go to this long-term treatment center. Some states, and sometimes you'll get lucky where the judge will actually say, okay, you're leaving here, but we're court ordering you to go here for 90 days or 60 days, however long. I can also tell you that insurance drives a lot of that. You want to add
also, when you, okay. Yeah.
Go ahead, Sean.
Also with this, remembering that every session you have with any client, whether it's via group or one-on-one or whatever you're going to be doing, normally within that, you have your protocol and how you do that, let them know about confidentiality and things like that. But there are also other things where you can breach confidentiality. So you have a duty to warn in a sense. So a lot of that comes from the Teresa off in the past, a court case where, and one part of that is you tell them that they're held under confidentiality, but there are regions or areas where you can break them. And that's if they're going to harm themselves or another, or it has to do with child or elderly abuse. So especially with youth, I mean, if they say that they've sexually molested a child or anything like that, then of course you have to report that. But also if they say they're going to harm themselves or another and they haven't done it yet, you definitely have a duty. You have a duty to warn that person. And a lot of times what happens if they say they're going to harm themselves, you might You might even direct them right into the hospital in order to have them admitted there so that they can be watched over time.
Because you have the duty to report.
What if it's a minor with a legal representative or guardian? How do you handle those cases?
Cases of involuntary commitments,
Yes.
very carefully.
Okay.
Because you're going to have different scenarios. Go ahead, Sean.
One way that I've always done committals usually is that if you have a family member who wants to commit somebody, these committals have to have certain language in them. You have to make sure that there's no subjective material in there. They have to be objective. You have viewed this person and they pose a threat to themselves or others. Like if they're drunk driving or something like that, I mean, they could harm somebody. But you have to have some built up over time in a sense where saying this person can harm others. They're hazardous to other people. They might cost other people their lives. They have to be seen or heard. They can't be hearsay or anything like that. So you always write that objectively. Objectively, not subjectively. Because a lot of times the court, the attorneys and stuff like that will look at that and say, this is too subjective. I'm not going to allow this. But I always need at least two people for that. Two people who know that person.
And two people to sign the affidavit. So, yeah. But when you're working with a family member and you're trying to get a child or an adult voluntary or involuntary commitment, it can sometimes be very difficult. I've had those situations where I have had to, explain, and I think part of the piece is that maybe the parents are not educated on the process. So you may want to take some time educating on the process, and also there's this thing called, as a parent, wanting to do the best for your child or what they are feeling they're doing the best for that child, whether it is or is not. So you just need to work with that parent on getting them and helping them understand the seriousness of where they're at. Because if you have a child or an adult saying or doing something, acting, pulling out a knife and saying, I'm getting ready to kill you or kill myself, you have to act on that one way or the other. Any other questions on that before we move along? Sean, I think you were going to take this one and then I was going to feed off of it, if that's okay with you.
Okay. So we've talked a little bit about self-identification from natives. So how they self-identify, looking at community or family. So sometimes we might have to be able to, with cultural knowledge, to be able to assess that, is to ask the community or family whether what this person is saying is a cultural thing or not. Then again, we might also need to look at like medicine peoples or healers or anything like that. Remember to utilize the community or family that they're actually from and not a totally different community. Remembering not to stereotype by tribes or beliefs or practices like we talked about before. Remembering that we can't come from our own professional or cultural bias. So we need to look at other cultures as, this is their belief system, and we need to be a little more humble and have humility with that, because if we don't know, we need to ask. So to make those things clear. Remembering that the medicine peoples or spiritual peoples, healers of that culture might be able to assist with that. Also remembering I talked about the distress level, but remembering that to properly evaluate those from other cultures is very important to understand the culture which you are assessing. Professional, ethnic, or cultural bias comes from others in this situation, the profession. So the issue is normally that not enough follow-up, referral, or consultation is taken seriously, and not as described within DSM-5, where those that come from a particular culture or community is consulted with. This does not mean to check with the whole other tribe or family, because the tribal practices or beliefs are not always the same everywhere you go. A lot of them look very different. Remembering that within family, they might not have the same knowledge as, you know, some of the native spiritual people within the tribe. They might not believe the same. They could be going to church or something like that and not want anything to do with the culture, but we need to look at the culture itself. So this would, you know, looking at from another community or family would kind of be poor practice in utilizing a whole different culture than what we're assessing at that time.
Sean, this is Lee. A quick comment to add is there are some tribal programs who have natives on their behavioral health program staff who understand the ways of the communities they're working in. And there used to be a time when the IHS or Indian Health Service used to have staff, including traditional healers who would be part of a treatment team, if you will, who would assist with the diagnosis and the treatment plan. And we also recognize that the tribal voc rehab program are permitted to use some of their funds to include as appropriate traditional healers as part of the individualized plan for employment. And just going on what Sean said about being careful and respectful, how the tribal voc rehab programs choose to incorporate their service is really up to them. But they may need to consult with their community elders or individuals who will provide the cultural appropriateness of providing that service. Not necessarily telling you what to do, but giving you advice as to what would be the appropriate cultural response. Here at AIVRTTAC, we don't have one single recommendation to any VR program as to how this should be developed or designed. So this is an area that we need to look at before we provide maybe some best practices for the TVR programs to use. Thank you.
Thank you, Lee and Teresa and Sean. This will be our last slide for today's presentation because we simply just ran out of time today, and we have so much more information that we want to provide on this topic. So remaining of the presentation, we will move to the next webinar in this series, but we are going to cover this slide and then any questions you may have.
I think we covered this slide, Jamie. So you may just want to take questions and answers for everything we've covered already.
Yeah, so let's shift to question and answer. We've got about 10 minutes. We've got Sean and Teresa. So anybody out there that has any questions, please let us now's your time. Let us get you some answers.
Yeah. And Teresa, if you'll stop sharing, John will go ahead and pull up the remaining slides for the closing out.
Sure. There we go.
This is such interesting and much needed information. And I just want to thank Sean and Teresa for bringing this to us and sharing with the AIVRS programs.
Throughout the PowerPoint or throughout the presentation, I was following in the chat box, and we've got quite a few comments in there where people have been discussing, you know, the incarceration and the co-occurring issues within the incarceration of the Native American population, and specifically within the male Native American population. Karen had asked about dissociative disorders, and if we're going to cover that, and I responded that we're going to be talking about some specific mental illness in the series later in the series. So stay tuned, and that's what we're putting up here on the screen now is the next presentations. And Meredith, I see that your hand's up, so I'm going to give you the floor.
I'm sorry, I was gonna put something in chat. I pressed the wrong one, but yeah, I could share. I just want to say to Sean, thank you for the information regarding the oh gosh, bipolar information where it could relate to traditional practices as far as becoming healers, because I see that in a lot of our youth. And I heard in our tradition and our culture that at some point in time, there will come a time where we will have a lot of people becoming healers. And if this may be the time, I don't know, because of the pandemic, you know, I see a lot of, I've heard, and I know a couple youth who are experiencing these things there, and they come with anxiety. And I know they're experiencing anxiety from the things they are seeing or having dreams about. And I just wanted to share that. Thank you.
This is
Thank you
Philip.
so much, Meredith.
This is Philip. I have one question. Is it true that our chemicals level off with age and we're less likely to have episodes?
Would you like me to answer that, Sean, or do you want to answer that?
Go ahead.
Okay, did I hear him correctly? Did he say that he had been told that like medications don't work better as we age? Is that what the question was?
Well, no, I heard that our chemicals level off with age and we're less likely to have episodes.
Oh, and that can be true. But again, we can't fit everybody in a box because everybody is different. But absolutely, that can be true that as you age with some diagnoses, you may get better. But there's all types of criteria of getting better. One of those is, you know, getting all the supportive services that you can in place, taking the appropriate medicines, which is you know, when someone is diagnosed and you're getting placed on a medication, people get so frustrated because 9 times out of 10, the first medication that doctor prescribes you is not going to work. It's kind of like a thing that you're going to have to go through to experiment with several types of medications to see what works with you in your chemical imbalance, if that makes sense. I've seen that time and time again where consumers get frustrated because this medicine or this combination is not working with them. But to answer your question, SMI patients, they can get better. They absolutely can. And I believe that. I believe that they need a circle of support I believe that we need to, especially when working with Native Americans, we have to take into effect of where they are and the historical trauma piece. And I believe that if they're on the right medications and if they're doing everything that they need to do, that they can get better. That's not to say that everybody will, because again, you cannot fit one person in a box.
Okay, thanks.
You're
So
welcome.
we got a quick question in the chat box. We're down to 2 minutes, but often VR receive referrals for general anxiety disorder. And this is pretty much a catch-all for a lot of us in the VR world. And Paul was asking, what are some of the recommendations for these types of referral? Just that generic, general
Mental
referral.
health agency.
For recommendations.
And they haven't gotten help.
Right.
Mental health, they need to go to a mental health counselor. Have they even gotten an assessment?
Some of them don't, some of them do. Probably the majority of them don't. They're just diagnosed through IHS as having general
But
anxiety.
they're not diagnosed with SMI.
Right.
Right, that's the ticket. So being diagnosed with SMI is a process. And sometimes depending on the situation, it could be a very long process. Sometimes depending on the situation, it is actually a very short process. So if someone is just dealing with, I mean, I should say we all, but 1 in 4 people in America have some type of mental diagnosis or mental health illness.
So your recommendation then is to make sure that there's an assessment done and make sure that there is a connection with the mental health agency.
Absolutely.
First and foremost.
Absolutely.
Okay.
That's good. You used to be nice and clean.
And a lot of that is usually managed with medication.
And therapy.
Well, I want to thank everyone for joining us today. This is very interesting information. It's very helpful because we have not had the opportunity to have experts on with us on this topic. And I'm just thankful again for Teresa and Sean joining us and providing all of this wonderful information. And we will continue the remainder of this presentation on the next webinar. In this series. Right now, John has put up the survey link, so make sure to fill out the survey. That's the only way we know how to improve on what we do and any information we provide. So please fill out the survey information, and the link is there now. And I'd like to also say that we have upcoming webinar on March the 3rd, and that is with Wayne Daigle. On employment development and job placement. That'll be at the same time, 10 a.m. Mountain Standard Time. And then March the 17th, we will have our monthly talking circle where we will be doing an overview of this presentation and also discussing Wayne's presentation on employment development. So thank you again, everyone, for joining us. Sorry we went over a little bit today, but we felt like it was very important for everyone to be able to add their questions or comments on any of the very important topics we had today. So thanks, everyone.
And I know, I'm going to jump in here real quick. Meredith, I know you had some questions. If you'd email us, we can definitely get that information and then get an answer back to you as well.
And be looking for the announcement for the remainder of this series. There'll be 3 more webinars in this series, and Teresa and Sean, I believe, will be presenting in those webinars as well. And so be on the lookout for those announcements so that you can continue on with this mental health and VR webinar series.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. We enjoyed it.
Have a good afternoon.
Thanks.
Thank you.
If the presenters want to stay on, we will have a quick chat and then we'll
Okay.
finish up.
Not a problem.
Thank you. Sorry, I had my mic on. I don't know if you heard anything. Sorry.
No problem.
We heard everything.